3 years have passed since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, but few imagined this lengthy battle. Putin believed he could rule Ukraine in weeks. What happened? As Russian troops approached Kyiv, how did a perfect strategy fail? An unexpected event changed everything, making the fight more bitter than ever while the world watched. Discover what transpired and why Putin's victory was thwarted. War progress between Russia and Ukraine. Since then, Russia and Ukraine have fought attrition. Ukraine first pushed Russia's forces back and launched an unsuccessful counteroffensive. Russia has slowly expanded into Ukraine with missile barrages and a large number of soldiers in recent months. Avdiivka was the pinnacle of that advance, but Russia also took other, less strategic land in 2024. Ukraine appeared to be dying. The U.S. rescued them. Following months of political infighting, it approved a $61 billion aid program for Ukraine, giving Kyiv the military weaponry it needed when it needed it most. This left Russia where? Russia has a dilemma. After investing so much in the war, Russia cannot afford to lose, but Putin worries that it may not be able to win. That means what? This video will answer that question, starting with why Russia can't afford to lose the war. Simple reason, it'll pay to reconstruct Ukraine. Financial aspects of Russia's invasion are very impossible to avoid, according to the Atlantic Council. Ukraine's rehabilitation may cost Russia. Russia has destroyed Ukrainian infrastructure and supply lines, in addition to killing people and destroying social systems. At least $500 billion is expected to be spent rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure, replenishing war supplies, and attempting to recover its economy. Russia paying would be the most logical. The Atlantic Council suggests using $300 billion of frozen Russian assets in Europe, Asia, and North America to pay some of that hefty payment. It shows that the EU and US are already proposing ways to spend the money, if lawful. However, that may not work. Seizing Russian assets may present legal challenges for their owners. In April 2024, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill that could unfreeze assets it possesses to bolster Ukraine's military effort. Using such money to supply Ukraine while it fights would preclude rebuilding. About $240 billion remain. The U.S. maintains $6 billion of Russia's frozen assets for rebuilding. Even that method is risky. Russia holds foreign assets after all. In December 2023, the Kremlin said it may grab Western assets if it supported Ukraine with frozen assets. Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said there is a list of Russia's needs, but didn't indicate how valuable it is. If Russia loses, it may not be able to seize Western assets. That would further strain relations with a weak West, forcing Russia to return those assets to their owners while losing its own. Suppose the asset seizure doesn't happen. Impact of sanctions. Any peace deal Russia signs will undoubtedly require it to pay for its actions in Ukraine. If the West tightens sanctions on Russia, that could cause problems. If Russia loses, those sanctions could prevent it from rebuilding its force to attack again for a few years. Russia has adjusted effectively to wartime sanctions. Before the war, barely a third of Russia's exports were sanctioned, according to Econpol's first quarter 2024 sanctions report. It found creative ways to avoid sanctions. Exports fell 32%, while imports rose 17%. Econpol notes that 61% of Russia's sanctioned imports originate from China, suggesting that Moscow has supply networks to assist it bypass sanctions. That may seem good for Moscow, but sanctions have had an impact. Since the war began, the ruble has plunged by 30%, and Western sanctions may produce long-term technology and labor shortages. The latter difficulties will worsen as the war continues, as Russia may lose more industrial workers. In conclusion, sanctions have had an impact, but not as much as the West wanted. If Russia loses, it could be retained or strengthened, making it harder for Russia to recover from the financial burden of rebuilding Ukraine. It would also become more dependent on China for economic support, which we'll discuss later. Already mentioned, workforce shortages, demographic crisis. According to a January 2024 Moscow Times story, Rosstat, Russia's national statistics organization, predicts the country's population could shrink to 138.8 million by 2046. That's 7.3 million fewer people than it has now, with the same agency predicting a 15 million plus reduction in 22 years. Its prediction estimates that 4,000 Russian deaths outnumber births per year, with immigration not accounting for that figure. Only 4,000 individuals enter the country annually, less than a sixth of the natural decline. This shows that Russia's population is aging and younger individuals are having fewer children. Why is this important in the Ukraine war? The mention of younger individuals not having children should hint. The war has killed thousands of Russia's youth, and thousands more may die if Ukraine can keep fighting until Russia surrenders. The Ukraine's Armed Forces General Staff reports that Russia has lost 46,940 troops in Ukraine since the war began, a huge figure given the country's population crisis. Nearly 500,000 soldiers won't have children, which could boost Russia's economy. After the conflict, 500,000 people won't be able to help Russia's business. If the battle lasts 2 more years, the number could reach 1 million, worsening the situation. Simply said, sending so many people to a war that Russia loses will hurt its economy for years. Add sanctions and Ukraine rebuilding costs, and a Russian loss now might cost hundreds of billions or trillions over the next few years. What if it wins? Russia can't afford to win or lose the Ukraine war, we declared at the beginning of the film. You see how losing may be so bad, but winning shouldn't be. Not necessarily. Even if Russia wins, it will pay many of those expenses. Russia's population problem persists regardless of the outcome. Ukraine claims it has lost 46,000 men, with more to follow if the war continues. Ukraine's 38 million people would help with labor workforce concerns, but it would be a short-term cure. While Russia won, the West is unlikely to lift sanctions. The sanctions against Moscow are based on pre-war sanctions. They'd still hurt Russia's economy, but not as much as if Russia lost. Rebuilding costs money. Putin doesn't want Ukraine destroyed. This war is driven by his ambition to rule, not destroy, the country which he believes is Russian. Even if he wins, he'll have to pay to reconstruct Ukraine into an economically self-sufficient part of Russia. Thus, the rebuilding bill will be the same whether Russia wins or loses. It may be heavier. Ukraine would remain independent and get Western backing if Russia lost. Russian economy. Unfreezing Russian assets for Ukraine and loan programs could aid its recovery, but such support would vanish under Russian control. A strong Ukraine dominated by Russia would threaten Europe, making Western nations unlikely to back its success. Russia would also face challenges maintaining control, requiring a costly military presence to suppress rebellions. Ukraine's recovery under Putin, rather than Zelensky, would be unlikely. Russia risks replicating the Soviet Union's financial strain, which contributed to its collapse despite comprising 10.5% of the global economy in 1991. Today, Russia's share is just 3.5%, April 2022, with GDP per capita dropping from $16,000 in 2013 to $2,200 in 2023, ranking 78th globally. The conflict has already cost Russia $211 billion, with potential future costs exceeding $2 trillion if rebuilding Ukraine and integrating its population. Ukraine's GDP per capita in 2022 was only $4,534, requiring massive investments to elevate it to Russian levels. Despite economic sanctions, Russia's GDP grew 5.5% in Q3 2023 compared to 2022, driven primarily by war spending. In 2024, defense spending is projected at $386 billion, making Russia the second highest military spender. However, this growth is unsustainable as it depends on military expenditures, not exports. Sanctions have cut Russian GDP by 7% from pre-war levels, capped oil prices, and closed Western airspace and ports, further straining the economy. Domestic policies, such as raising interest rates to 16%, have kept the economy afloat, but hurt ordinary Russians with 7% inflation and reduced spending power. Additionally, foreign companies operating in Russia generated $213.9 billion in 2022, but are restricted from withdrawing funds, inadvertently supporting the war. In 2023, military expenses consumed 40% of Russia's budget and 10% of GDP. This war-driven economy inflates GDP through spending on military salaries, equipment, and operations. However, post-war, Russia's manufacturing base may falter, worsened by the loss of 5 million workers, rising wages, and declining GDP per capita. Non-Western trade partners. If Russia wins the war and incorporates over 30 million Ukrainians, its labor crisis could worsen as disgruntled workers may resist rather than rebuild. Russia already struggles with job creation, living wages, and a stable cost of living. Additionally, a victory would deepen its geopolitical isolation, especially from the West, due to sanctions and condemnation, forcing it to rely heavily on China for trade. China has capitalized on this situation. In March 2024, it spent $8.79 billion on Russian fossil fuels, making up 49% of Russia's sales. China exported $10 billion worth of cars to Russia in 2023, 7 times more than in 2022, and bilateral trade surged 64% to $240 billion, according to Reuters. While these ties help Russia bypass Western sanctions, they also increase China's leverage over Moscow. Beijing has strategically filled the gap left by Western nations, becoming Russia's primary commercial partner. If Russia wins, this dependence will grow as Western countries are unlikely to re-engage. This dynamic empowers China to exploit Russia's isolation for its advantage, as evidenced in April 2024. Following reports of potential U.S. sanctions on Chinese banks dealing with Russia, major Chinese banks have reduced financing for Russian transactions. Many Chinese businesses now rely on smaller banks and cryptocurrencies, raising security concerns. A Chinese appliance producer noted that larger banks take months to process payments, making formal routes impractical for trade. Will Russia suffer from this war, regardless of the outcome? Comment below about Russia's future. Can Russia resist Chinese and Western economic and political pressure? If you liked this video, like and subscribe to the channel for more interesting analyses. See you next video.